My husband laughed when I walked into that boardroom. Not a small laugh, not the kind you swallow and pretend didn't happen. He threw his head back and laughed like I'd just told the funniest joke of his life, and then he looked at his father sitting at the head of the table and said, "I told you she'd show up." I stood in the doorway for a second. Just a second. Then I walked in and sat down. I had driven 4 hours to get there. I hadn't eaten since the night before. My hands were shaking slightly inside my blazer pockets, but nobody could see that, and I made sure nobody would. His father, my father-in-law, looked at me the way he always did, like I was something that had gotten stuck to the bottom of his shoe. He folded his hands on the table and said very calmly, "Serena, you were not invited to this meeting." "I know," I said, "but what you're about to vote on concerns me directly, so I'm staying." My husband leaned over to the company's attorney on his right and whispered something. The attorney nodded. My husband sat back with the expression of a man who had already won. He had been wearing that expression for the last 8 months. I need to back up, because none of this will make sense unless you understand what I gave up, and what I built, and how completely I trusted the wrong person with both. I met my husband when I was 26. He was 31, finishing his MBA, working part-time at his father's regional equipment supply company, a small, unglamorous business that distributed industrial to contractors across the Midwest. He wasn't rich, the company wasn't impressive, but he was charming and ambitious, and he looked at me like I was the most interesting person he'd ever met, and at 26, that felt like enough. I was a forensic accountant. Not the TV version. I wasn't tracking serial killers or testifying in murder trials. I audited companies. I found where money went when it wasn't supposed to go anywhere. I was good at it. I had been recruited out of college by a firm in Chicago, and by the time I met my husband, I had already worked on 3 federal fraud cases and been promoted twice. He thought that was fascinating. He asked me questions about it on our first date, our second, our third. He wanted to know how financial fraud worked, how people hid money, how shell companies were structured, how forensic accountants found the thread and pulled until everything unraveled. I thought he was curious. I thought he was smart. I thought we were building something together. I did not think even once that he was taking notes. We got married 2 years later. I paid for most of the wedding because his savings were tied up in a business expansion. His words. I didn't mind. I was making good money and I loved him, and I thought that's what you did when you built a life with someone. When his father had a minor heart attack the following year and needed to step back from the company, my husband took over as CEO. The business was doing okay but not great. Thin margins, an outdated client list, some debt from a warehouse expansion that hadn't paid off yet. Over the next 3 years, I spent nearly every weekend helping him restructure it. I went through their books. I found where they were bleeding money. I rewrote their vendor contracts. I helped them pivot towards servicing renewable energy installations, which turned out to be exactly the right call because that sector exploded. I did most of that work while also working my full-time job. I did it because I believed in him. I did it because when he looked at me across the kitchen table at midnight, papers spread between us, he would say, "I couldn't do any of this without you," and I believed that too. By year 5 of our marriage, the company had grown from 8 employees and about $3 million in annual revenue to 42 employees and just under $20 million. My husband was being written up in regional business journals. His father was back on the board, healthier, and glowing with pride. Nobody mentioned me in any of those articles. I told myself that was fine. He was the face of the company. I was behind the scenes. That was the deal. Except I was starting to realize slowly and then all at once that I hadn't actually agreed to that deal. It had just been decided for me. The first sign was small. He stopped asking my opinion on financial decisions. When I offered it anyway, he would smile and say, "I've got it handled, babe." Then he hired a CFO without telling me, even though we had talked for years about me eventually stepping into that role. When I brought it up, he said the timing wasn't right. When I asked when the timing would be right, He changed the subject. The second sign was the account. We had a joint investment account that I had funded almost entirely from my own income over 6 years. It held about $400,000. One afternoon I logged in to check something and found the balance at just under $12,000. I sat very still at my desk for a long time. When I asked him about it that evening, he told me he had moved the funds into a business account temporarily for a capital project, and he would move them back. I asked why he hadn't mentioned it. He said he hadn't wanted to stress me out. I said I would like to see the business account. He said he would send me the statements. He never sent them. I did not ask again. That was my mistake, or rather, it looked like my mistake to anyone watching. What I actually did was start keeping records. I had been trained to find the thread. I knew what it looked like. And I had been watching my husband's company's finances closely enough over 5 years that when something started to move wrong, I felt it before I could prove it. So I started pulling on the thread myself, quietly, at home, with access I still had, because he had never thought to remove me from the accounting software he'd asked me to set up in year 1. What I found took me 3 months to fully document. The investment account money had not gone to a capital project. It had gone into a series of transfers that routed through an LLC I had never heard of, registered in Delaware with a registered agent that I tracked back to his college roommate. A man who had been at our wedding, who came to our Christmas parties, who had shaken my hand and smiled at me for 8 years, while apparently serving as a conduit for my own money to disappear. There was more, not just my money. Vendor contracts had been inflated and the difference was being skimmed. There was a consulting fee going to another entity that I could not find any legitimate service record for. Small amounts, over a long period, adding up to something that was not small at all. I did not confront him. I knew better. Instead, I called a friend from my early career, a woman who now worked as a senior investigator at the SEC's regional office. I told her I needed to talk. She told me to come in. I drove to her office on a Tuesday afternoon and I laid out everything I had found, every transaction, every entity, every date. She looked at the documentation for a long time without saying anything. Then she said, "Serena, how long have you been sitting on this?" 3 months, I said. "Are you still living with him?" "Yes." She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "Okay, here's what we need to do." He asked me for a divorce 6 weeks later. He did it on a Sunday morning, very casually, like he was suggesting we try a different brunch place. He said we had grown apart. He said he wanted different things. He said he hoped we could be mature about the process. I asked what mature meant to him. He said it meant I would sign a post-nuptial agreement that had apparently been drafted, without my knowledge, 9 months earlier, waiving my right to any share of the company or its assets, in exchange for a lump sum payment of $75,000 and the right to keep my car and my personal belongings. $75,000. For 6 years of marriage. For the $400,000 that had disappeared from our joint account. For the weekends and the restructured contracts and the vendor negotiations and the pivot to renewable energy that had turned his family's struggling company into something worth many times that. I looked at the document for a long time. Then I put it on the table between us and I said, "I'll have my attorney look at it." He relaxed visibly. "Good. I think you'll find it's more than fair." "I'm sure you do," I said. That was the last real conversation we had. What happened over the next 4 months I can only describe from the outside. Because on the inside I was just trying to stay steady. My attorney was calm and thorough and deeply unimpressed by my husband's post-nuptial agreement. She filed a response that was, in her words, a polite opening move. The company's attorneys filed something back. There were depositions scheduled. But the thing my husband did not know, the thing he had apparently not stopped to consider, despite all those conversations early in our marriage about how forensic accounting worked and what it could uncover, was that the SEC investigation had already been underway for 3 months before he handed me those divorce papers. He did not know that I had walked into that federal office on a Tuesday afternoon. He did not know that his college roommate, when contacted by investigators, had retained his own attorney and within 2 weeks agreed to cooperate. He did not know that the consulting fees, the inflated vendor contracts, the Delaware LLC, and several things I hadn't even found yet were now part of an active federal inquiry. He did not know any of this because I hadn't told him. I had simply gone home after each meeting with investigators, made dinner, watched television, and waited. The morning of the shareholder and board meeting, the one where my husband planned to formalize a restructuring that would have moved the remaining company assets into a new entity, effectively shielding them. I drove 4 hours and walked through that door. His father looked at me across that table. He said I hadn't been invited. I said I knew. And then the door behind me opened and 2 people in suits walked in, and they were not shareholders. I want to be careful about what I say here, 'cause there are things still being resolved and my attorney has been very clear about that. But I can tell you what happened in that room. My husband's face changed. I had never seen that particular expression on him before. It was the face of a man realizing, in real time, that the ground he thought he was standing on was not solid. His father looked between my husband and the people who had just entered, and something shifted in his expression too. Not guilt, not yet, but confusion, and then a kind of dawning. The meeting did not proceed as planned. His attorney leaned over and spoke quietly to my husband for about 30 seconds. Then my husband stood up and said, in a voice that was very nearly steady, that the meeting needed to be postponed. Nobody argued with him. They didn't argue because they were looking at the documents that had just been placed on the table. I had already seen those documents. I had helped compile them. I stood up, buttoned my blazer, and walked out of that room the same way I had walked in, quietly, without looking back. In the parking lot, I sat in my car for a few minutes. My hands were still shaking a little. I hadn't eaten. I was exhausted in a way that had been sitting behind my eyes for months. I called my attorney. "It's done, I know," she said. "We got confirmation an hour ago. How are you?" "I'm okay," I said. And the strange thing is, I meant it. People ask me sometimes what the hardest part was. Not the legal process, not the financial loss, not the years of work that had been quietly leveraged against me. They ask what hurt most. It was the Sunday morning. The casualness of it. The way he said mature, like he was extending me a courtesy. Like the $75,000 was generosity rather than erasure. Like 6 years of my life, 6 years of my expertise and my labor and my absolute trust, were worth exactly that, and I should be grateful. That's the part that made me understand, finally, that I hadn't been in a partnership. I had been in a transaction, and I hadn't known I was the thing being transacted. I don't think about him very often now. That sounds like something people say and don't mean, but I genuinely don't. There's a lot of legal process still grinding forward, and my attorney handles most of it. And occasionally I have to sign something or provide documentation, and then I close my laptop and make coffee and move on with the rest of my day. What I think about more is that Tuesday afternoon, driving to that federal office. Walking in with a folder of documents I had spent 3 months assembling. Sitting across from my old colleague and watching her read through everything. She had looked up at one point and said, "You know what the thing is about forensic accounting?" "What?" I said. "You can't unhide money. You can move it. You can route it through 12 entities. You can call it anything you want. But the transactions are still there. They always are." I thought about that on the drive home. About all the times my husband had asked me, early on, how fraud cases got broken open, how investigators found the thread. I had told him, across various dinner tables and kitchen counters over the years, "You follow the money, you are patient, you document everything, you don't move until you're sure." I had told him exactly how it worked. I just don't think he ever imagined I would use it. The restructuring vote never happened. The board has since been informed of the full scope of what investigators found, including several things that were not my doing to uncover, Things that came out once the LLC structure started being pulled apart. My father-in-law, from what I understand, is cooperating. He may not have known everything. I genuinely don't know. The divorce is proceeding through a different calculation now. The post-nuptial agreement was voided. My attorney is thorough and tireless and slightly terrifying in depositions, and I am very glad she is on my side. The company I helped build, the vendor contracts I rewrote, the sector pivot I identified, the financial structure I set up from scratch. All of that is still there, in the records, with timestamps and e-trails and version histories. Digital documentation is patient in a way that people are not. My mother called me last week. She said, I never trusted him. I told her I knew. She had said it at the wedding very quietly, and I had not wanted to hear it. You okay? She asked. Yes, I said, and again, I meant it. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from pretending, for months, that nothing is wrong. From going home every evening and making dinner and watching television with a person who is planning to discard you. From holding everything you know very carefully inside yourself while the timeline unspools and the documentation grows and you wait. And there is a specific kind of relief when you stop pretending. I walked out of that boardroom and sat in my car and let my hands shake. Nobody saw that. Nobody needed to. The shaking wasn't fear. It was just the thing your body does when it has been holding tension for a very long time and finally doesn't have to anymore. I finished my coffee. I started the car. I drove. I still have my car, as it turns out. Not because my husband graciously offered it in his insulting settlement proposal, but because it is registered in my name and always was. Just like the documentation is in my name. Just like the $400,000 that vanished is, legally, very much still a matter of record. He thought he married someone who would be too overwhelmed to look closely. Someone who loved him enough to take his word for things. Someone who, when handed a settlement agreement on a Sunday morning, would be grateful for $75,000 and a clean exit. He forgot who he had been asking questions all those years. He forgot who had been answering them.